Welcome to the last lesson in this chapter, where we are going to take one module from the modular monolith and move it into a dedicated service. This is going to transition our system from a monolith application into a microservices system running behind an API gateway. In one of the previous lessons, we mentioned what are some of the benefits of microservices, such as independent deployability, organizational autonomy, scalability, and so on. And what I wanted to highlight here is that microservices essentially elevate the logical boundaries that we have in place inside of a modular monolith into physical boundaries. If we take a look at the current state of our modular monolith system, we introduced an API gateway, and we are also using RabbitMQ for communication between our modules. And now what we want to do is to take the ticketing module from the modular monolith and extract it into a dedicated service. This is going to allow us to scale the ticketing service based on the current requirements. And for example, when we encounter a traffic spike, we can easily scale up the ticketing service to have multiple instances, and this will allow us to handle the increased traffic without losing any business. What we are going to implement in this lesson is adding a dedicated service for the ticketing module, and I'm going to call this the Evently Ticketing API. The ticketing service is still going to have a dedicated schema inside of the database, and I won't be transitioning this into a separate database because it's not really required for our use case. However, this process should be simple because all we have to do is take the ticketing schema and move it into its own database. We will also have to update our API gateway configuration and connect the ticketing service to our RabbitMQ instance so that it can continue communicating with the other modules inside of our system. And now let's move into the code and see how we are going to extract a module into a dedicated service. Let's start by explaining how we are going to approach this transition. What we want to do is to introduce another instance of the Evently API project, which is going to only configure the ticketing module. Inside of the original API project, we're going to remove the setup for the ticketing module, and what's going to be left is the events, users, and attendance modules. Another thing that's going to make our job easier is that these two services are going to be identical from the API perspective. I'm going to sacrifice some code duplication to make this entire transition simpler, and let's start by introducing an ASP.NET Core Web API for the new ticketing service. So I'm going to add a new project into this folder, and it's going to be an ASP.NET Core Web API. I'm going to call it Evently Ticketing API. It's going to be a .NET 8 project. I'm going to enable Docker as well as OpenAPI support. And let's go ahead and create this. Now I'm going to clean up the existing program file in our new ticketing API. And I'm going to remove most of these comments and any other warnings from static code analysis. Let's also get rid of this default endpoint and the weather forecast type. We can also remove HTTPS redirection because we don't need it, and this is what we should be left with. The next thing I want to do is to add a project reference from the ticketing API to the modules ticketing infrastructure project. So let me find this project, here it is, and let me add the respective project reference. This is going to expose this project to the ticketing module, as well as any cross-cutting concerns that are referenced inside of the common folder. Now I'm going to update the project file here and get rid of these values that we are setting through the directory build props. And let's go ahead and update these NuGet packages to be the same as the Evently API project. Because these services will have the same task, we can just copy these values around. And what I want to have is a HealthChecks UI client NuGet package, the OpenAPI package for Swagger, as well as Swashbuckle ASP.NET Core. I'm also adding the Serilog integration with the Serilog ASP.NET Core and the Seek sync. I'm also including the EF Core Tools package if I want to run database migrations in the future. So let's close this down. And the next thing I want to take care of is the application settings files between my two services. So what we can do is take out the ticketing settings and move them into the ticketing API project. Because this service is only going to be responsible for the ticketing module, it makes sense to include these configuration files inside of this API project. Next, I'm going to copy the extensions, middleware, and OpenTelemetry projects and move them into the ticketing API project. Then I'm going to refactor and adjust any namespaces. And this is going to give me the Trace ID middleware, the exception handler, as well as the diagnostics config, and I'm going to update the service name to Evently Ticketing API. We're going to use this in just a moment when we are configuring OpenTelemetry. Then what I want to do is to also take the app settings JSON file. So let's copy everything that we have here and let's paste it in the respective file in the ticketing API service. I'm going to do the same for the app settings development JSON file. So let me take everything that's here and add it into the ticketing API development JSON file. So let me paste this here. And now I can start cleaning up these values. So the ticketing API service will be connecting to the database, to Redis, as well as RabbitMQ, so we can leave this in place. It's also going to need the authentication settings and the Keycloak health check, so I'm going to leave this. When it comes to the log filters, it only cares about the ticketing inbox and outbox jobs, so I'm going to leave that in place. And then I'm going to update the application name from Evently API to Evently Ticketing API. I will do the same in the app settings JSON file. So it's going to say Evently Ticketing API, and then the other things can remain unchanged. Then I'm going to finally update the program file by basically just taking all of this code here and introducing it as part of the Evently Ticketing API. So let's go ahead and paste this in, import the missing namespaces, and then we have to fix the compile errors. And it's going to be very obvious what the errors are. We are missing the references to the attendance, users, and events modules. So I'm just going to delete all of these references because we only care about the ticketing module. I'm also going to update this array here. We only introduce the configuration files for the ticketing module. As far as our middleware, everything is the same as in the Evently API project, and here let's also pass in just the ticketing module configure consumers, and also here in the array where we are passing in the modules for the application assemblies. And you can see that it was fairly easy to make these adjustments. And now what I'm going to do is to remove the reference to the ticketing module from the Evently API project. So let's go ahead and do this. And now if I go to the program file of the Evently API, it's going to become obvious what we will need to remove. So I'm going to remove everything that's referencing an assembly or a static method from the ticketing module. And I also need to get rid of the call to add ticketing module. And one thing that remains is this array here, which specifies the configuration files for each module. And what remains in the Evently API project is the events module, users module, attendance module, and we got rid of the ticketing module. And then other than that, there are no changes that we need to make. Notice that we don't have to touch anything about our module files because they are all logically isolated from each other and everything is nicely encapsulated inside of the modules. At this point, I can go ahead and update the Docker file inside of the Evently API project, and I'm just going to create a new one on top. So I'm going to say add Docker support and add a new Docker file. And this is going to override the existing file that we had in place. And now it's only referencing the attendance, users, and events modules. I will go ahead and do the same inside of the Evently Ticketing API project. And you will see that here we are mainly referencing the ticketing projects. However, there are references to the events and users projects, and this is because of the integration events projects that we need to share between our services. Now, because we are still inside of one solution, we can just reference the respective projects. But as soon as we want to move from one solution into multiple solutions for each of our services, we're going to need to distribute our integration events using NuGet packages. So let's go ahead and close this down. I'm also going to close the old Evently API, and now I want to configure the ticketing API with our Docker Compose setup. So let's go ahead and say add container orchestrator support, and I'm going to say add this to the Docker Compose file. And if I open up the Docker Compose YAML file, we should see the Evently Ticketing API project. So let's go ahead and add it right under the Evently API. I'm going to add the container name and say Evently Ticketing API. And then let's expose this on the ports 5100 and 5101. You can also update the Docker Compose override file if you care about the order in which these services are specified. So for example, we could first have the Evently Ticketing API and the Evently Gateway, which is the same order that we have inside of the Docker Compose YAML file. Now, if you try to build the project at this point, you will see that we are running into some errors. This is because of the apply migrations method. So we have to fix it in both of our projects. So let me fix it inside of the Evently API project. I will need to remove this line of code. And if you try to build the project again, you will see a bunch of errors show up. And this is mainly going to be our test project. So let's go ahead and fix what we can. I will not be fixing everything. We need to update the integration test project to reference the Evently ticketing API. So I'm going to remove this reference and let's add a reference to Evently ticketing API. At this point, it's going to complain that the integration test web app factory program file is inaccessible. This is because we need to add the partial class to the bottom of the program file. So let's go ahead and do that in the Evently ticketing API project. And now the integration test web app factory should stop complaining. Another thing that could be causing us trouble is the architecture test for our solution. So let me go into Evently architecture tests and then let's update the module tests. So I'm just going to get rid of the tests for the ticketing module because it's now a dedicated service and we don't need to check if there are references to the ticketing modules. So I'm going to leave the namespaces as is because we don't need to bother with that. And then the next thing that we should probably fix is the Evently integration tests. Here, some of our use cases are going to fail. For example, the register user use case, because it has a reference to the ticketing module. I don't want to fix these tests as part of this lesson. I'm going to leave this as an exercise for you, and what you probably want to do is to have multiple instances of a web application factory running. One for the Evently API project, and then another for the Evently ticketing API. As for the add item to cart test case, I will have to remove this test case because it's completely dependent on the ticketing module. Let's also remove the constant and just leave an empty test file. And then the last class that should be complaining is the command helpers. So let's go ahead and remove this method and leave an empty class. And at this point, we should be able to build our project. So let's move on to the next step of our migration. In the chapter about authentication and authorization, we implemented role-based access control and introduced roles and permissions for managing access to our endpoints. We also implemented this as a cross-cutting concern in the common infrastructure project, and we introduced a permission service abstraction that's going to allow us to access the permissions from the user's module. However, now we want to extract the ticketing module into its own service. So we aren't able to use the permission